Welcome everyone to this 33rd Halmstad Colloquium, and this is the School of Information Technology's Distinguished Speaker Series. And we are today very happy and proud to welcome Ulrike Schultze, who is Associate Professor in Information Technology and Operations Management at Cox Business School at the Southern Methodist University in Texas, US. Ulrike holds a bachelor thesis and a master's degree in information systems from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and she earned her PhD in management with a concentration in information systems from Case Western Reserve University. And in her research, she has explored different things, among other things, the complex relationship between information technology and work practices, and she has studied work practice implications in knowledge management and internet-based self-service technology. And she has also studied the implications of social media technologies, which we will hear more about today, and specifically the virtual world Second Life, with an interest in, among other things, identity work. And more recently, she has also explored issues related to digital innovation and sharing economy. Ulrike, she has published her work in most of the top-tier information systems journals, including, for instance, Information Systems Research, MIS Quarterly, European Journal of Information Systems, Journal of Information Technology, and Information and Organization. And she has also served on numerous journals and conferences, editorial boards, and also taken significant leadership roles in conferences such as Academy of Management and International Conference of Information Systems. And also, Ulrike has been a friend of Scandinavian information systems research for many years and is currently has a visiting appointment at informatics at Lund University. And we are very, very happy to have Ulrike here and hear more about her work on how technology in general and virtual worlds in particular can shape identity and create new forms of reality. And the talk today is entitled Becoming Real in Virtuality, Cyborgian Identity in Second Life. So please welcome Ulrike Schultze.
All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. As Magnus has mentioned, you know, I've been coming to Scandinavia. I think the first time I actually met you was when I was still a PhD student, and with a friend of mine, we came to Gothenburg, and Magnus was at Victoria Institute at the time, and somehow, you know, always came back to Gothenburg, had a visiting appointment at Victoria for a while, and now have been at Lund in a visiting position there for the past around about 6 years. So long-standing relationships and good relationships. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Okay, so as Magnus has already said, I'll be talking about the research I've been doing on Second Life, and particularly these issues of how do we deal with identity or identity issues as we're increasingly becoming cyborgs. And so the notion of cyborgs is one, you know, with a contemporary meaning that a lot of people are taking, and I included, is this notion that we now have multiple bodies. So you have a Facebook body, you have an email body, you have web page bodies, right? Bodies that, in addition to your physical body, you have to manage and to take care of and to essentially do identity work with. You know, unlike your real body, or just like your real body, the bodies that are out there in virtuality, in fact, also take on a life of their own. They do things that you don't want them to do, like what I just did, right? Sort of talk all over myself and, you know, get my tongue all twisted. Similarly, you know, sort of doing things, having gaffes, right, in your presentation of self, as your real body does. So your virtual bodies essentially take on lives of their own and do things that you don't necessarily want them to do. And so this is sort of what we understand understand as performative identity, right? Sort of a notion that your embodiments are performing who you become. And so there's very much an interest right now in understanding these things. And so this is what this sort of the background of the work, and where this is, what it is I'm trying to theorize. So what I thought I'd do is sort of untangle the title, sort of identify some of the key issues that are in the title, highlighted in the title. First, there's the issue of, the duality of reality and virtuality. So what we understand by duality is that, these are opposing thoughts in some sense that are brought together and are in tension and essentially have to be managed as a tension. And so if we think about what do we mean by reality, it's sort of the state of actual existence. This idea that we think of reality as facts that are outside of our own perception. And so they could be, in fact, be socially real, right, in the sense that other people are in agreement that this is real, and as long as it's not sort of outside of sort of the individual's perception, right, there's a sense of sort of institutional facts versus sort of these material facts that we frequently consider to be natural and therefore not in question, right? So, but that's obviously also contested. So what do we mean by virtuality? And so I think the key thing here is that virtuality says it's almost real, it's possibly real, it's ideal. So there's a sense of, when we talk about virtuality, which is frequently perceived now these days as a technology-enabled kind of reality, that it's not concrete, but it's an alternative to the real, and possibly a better alternative to the real, right? That there's a sense of its virtuousness, that it's an improvement over what we have in the real. So virtuality is sort of including or alluding to virtue as a concept. When we talk about cyborgs, and I've already alluded to the fact that what I mean by cyborgs is that we increasingly rely on, these virtual bodies that we have. Initially, the notion of cyborg was one of technology being embedded in the physical body, right? So, people with pacemakers are considered cyborgs and so on. But, these days it's, I think, even though if you don't have a pacemaker or any other kind of implant, you can consider yourself a cyborg, and there would be, I would be one of the people that says we're all cyborgs now, right? So that is essentially the position that I'm taking. And I think the key thing here is that, when we talk then about identity, it's very difficult to talk about, an online identity and an offline identity. And so by using the word Cyborgian identity, I'm trying to say, these in fact are very complexly intertwined identities that are coming together. And part of what certainly the people in Second Life struggled with is exactly how to, compile and make sense of who they are sort of in their physical embodiment, right, and sort of the sense of self that they have associated with their physical body, and the kind of person they're becoming by having these additional virtual bodies. So this is essentially why I'm using the term Cyborgian identity, to make it clear that I'm trying to meld these two things. So, one of the things that this sort of the landscape, the theoretical landscape that this work fits into, is a landscape of information systems we call socio-material theorizing. And so for those of you who don't know much about it, I just want to give you a little bit of background, because this is a very disciplinary, sort of discipline-specific kind of discourse or issue that we're dealing with in the field right now. So typically, the field of information systems has concerned itself with the question of the relationship of technology with the social, right? So the social, for example, being an organization or work practices, right? That's sort of the social, and how does the technology, in fact, interact with this? How do we explain phenomena? And so one view is to simply say, well, these are very discrete objects, and you implement information technology, if you implement an ERP system, and boom, certain organizational impacts will happen. This is what we call technological determinism, and that was certainly one way in which in the past it's been theorized. The other alternative is to simply say, we have an organization, and this is sort of the social determinism. We have an organization, the organization decides to either build a technology or implement a technology, and it's the social that will shape, basically what will happen once we bring the technology in. In fact, it will shape the technology. And so, the whole systems development idea, we can build perfect systems that can fit in perfectly to the organization and generate the kinds of impacts we want the organization to experience. Then, we have, another way of looking at this is that these two aren't all that discrete, right? There's an entanglement, there's there's a mutual dependency that essentially the social shapes the technological, and the technological then shapes the social again, right? So there's this notion of we've got these, nevertheless, two separate entities, but they're shaping each other, mutually shaping each other. And the latest push basically has been towards not separating the social from the technical. And so this is where, the people who talk about socio-materiality come in. And I would say in some sense, this is where, to me, the cyborg fits in. Right, so to me, understanding the cyborg is this complete entanglement, right, of the social and the technical. Of again, in my sense, in my case, the sense of self, right, as a concept, and then these various materialities, right, that we have. These various bodies, these various embodiments that we have, and understanding that. Now, when it comes to socio-material theorizing, we now make a distinction between strong socio-materiality and weak socio-materiality, where strong socio-materiality says that essentially ontologically you cannot separate the social from the material. That would basically be the same as saying the moon doesn't exist unless we look at it, measure it, interact with it, right? So that would be the strong position. And given that in information systems we're frequently dealing with social phenomena, right? Or even if it's material, desks and so on, they have been built. They have an entire social history in them. And so from that point of view, we're not talking about the moon and whether the moon exists without us looking at it, or dealing with it or engaging with it, right? So in some sense, it works given the social phenomena we're dealing with. It's not as strong a position as one might otherwise think. And the weaker, ways of thinking about socio-materiality is to say, there is merit in keeping the social, for example, discourses, separate from the material, because essentially by doing that, they each have a uniqueness. They have a uniqueness with regard to how we think about them, what they can add to the debate and what they can add to understanding. So keeping them separate, but yet recognizing that they're completely intertwined and in tension and, in this dualistic kind of relationship, and therefore constantly needing to be butted against each other. But a key motivation behind the socio-material theorizing is to take material seriously, which is something in information systems we haven't done all that well. We've tended to, privilege the social, privilege what organizations, the sense-making that people do, right? That what this computer means to me, it determines how I use it, right? And sort of the material aspects about its size, its weight, what it's capable of, right? That sort of goes into the background. It's all about my meaning and what it does for me if I use this machine, what it does, right? So all the social sort of social framings and social meanings of the technology, that's been, where our theorizing has tended to do well, and then, the actual material has gone into the background. So a lot of what socio-materiality, this movement, is doing is pushing to the forefront that we need to deal with material. And so in my case, right, I'm dealing with materials as diverse as the physical body, the virtual body, the machines, right, with which you go in. There's lots of materiality that essentially shapes and sort of is relevant in this context of virtual worlds and social media in general, right? So I think in my sort of the way I frame the study of Second Life is that it's sort of the, on a continuum of social media, it's the Cadillac, right, of social media, because it is about interrelating with others, but, we've got very, very rich tools with which to do it in a virtual world. So for those of you who have not ever been in Second Life or never seen it, these are just some images of Second Life. So a virtual world that is essentially a platform, where you can build anything. And that had an entire market associated with it, because essentially, if you went in as a newbie into Second Life, the first thing you wanted to do most probably is get new hair, get new clothes, or somebody had to create those. So there's an entire marketplace of people building, not only clothing, but cars and furniture and houses and, landscaping land, right? And so these are some of the things that you see here. And so this image here is one of our campus. So we had a presence in Second Life. And so if you ever go to SMU, you'll see a lot of these features, right? So we basically recreated, quote unquote, elements of our campus in virtuality. All right, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the data that I'm drawing on, the method that I relied on to do these studies, because essentially what I'll be doing in this talk is highlight 3 studies that sort of ask different questions around this issue of reality, virtuality, and identity, right? So I used what I call a photo diary method for data collection. So the first thing I did is I identified interviewees that needed to be close enough that I could actually interview them face to face. So my first interaction with them was a face-to-face interview for about 2 hours. And then for a 3-week period, they would keep what are called photo diaries. And this is a photo diary entry. So essentially people would take a snapshot of an incident that was in some way meaningful to them, right? Then they completed the diary portion of it, which was sort of asking the when, where, how, what, who questions. And so this snapshot here is Abigail talking about, what was going on when she saw this image. So she'd been out to lunch, she came back to her machine, she'd stayed logged into Second Life, and she saw her avatar sitting there exactly like you saw her, sitting on a swing. The swing was moving a little bit. The avatar was playing with its necklace. Her eyes were moving back and forth. And so Abigail goes, wow, she's alive. And she's thinking, and she's having all these feelings about her Second Life, right? And this is, by the way, not an uncommon experience. And so it really speaks, I think, to the technology and the fact that these avatars, 3D avatars, were very animated, and they had scripts in them, and therefore were performing. They were taking embodied action. And you could obviously decide what kind of scripts you wanted them to have and what kind of clothing you wanted them to wear. But, then they produce something, right? So these are sort of the basic elements, and then they produce something. And they produce, an identity, in this case, of being independent and having these thoughts, right? And sort of, and similarly, you could think about how this then relates back to the actual user, right? If the avatar is performing and essentially making you become something, becoming itself and making you become something. All right, so the 3 studies that I want to talk about. The first one is, looking at, these are, again, these are social media, therefore they are social interactions. And one of the things that we know through social interactions is that they create reality, right? I mean, it's through interactions that we get to the point of, having this social agreement about what is real and what is not. So the social construction of reality, actually requires interaction. And Goffman gives us, some really nice theoretical concepts to work with that we're using here. And so we're using his notion of involvement obligation. The second study is, sort of dealing with the this duality of reality and virtuality. that certainly my interviewees were struggling with. And because it has merit to say this incident was virtual versus this incident was real, and to make this distinction between real life and virtual life, right? It has merit, it sort of has benefits to be able to make these cuts. And at other times, it didn't have merit to make those cuts, so people didn't. But this study deals with this issue of, dealing with this duality and struggling, negotiating this duality. And for this, I don't know whether any of you know Dick Boland or have heard of him. He was my dissertation advisor, and he developed this notion of an engine of inquiry, which is really cool. And by the way, he developed it while he was walking in the woods in Sweden with a colleague of his. So, Dick Boland, my advisor, had long relations with Sweden before I was ever, sort of in the department. So anyhow. And then the last one is actually a paper that Magnus and I have been batting our, sort of heads against the wall with for a number of years now, dealing with sort of the performative production of identity and, looking at what we call discursive material practices, right, as the engine, if you want, for the production of identity. And so those are the three papers. The thing with all three of them is that none of them is published. They're all in various stages, and so part of the reason why I wanted to present these still in progress papers, is because I think they're A, cool ideas, and B, I'd like to get your feedback, and I'd prefer to be thinking about stuff I'm supposed to be writing about stuff rather than stuff I've published. You can read that anytime, anyhow. So very selfish reasons. All right. So the social interaction study. So here the issue was, to say, prior work on virtual worlds has frequently looked at, what makes these environments real, and frequently they will look at things like the fidelity, right? That the notion there is a real world, and now we just need to replicate it well enough so that people basically believe, they can forget the fact that this is virtual. Because a key thing about the success of virtual worlds is that you feel immersed. So how do you feel immersed? And the idea is you feel immersed when you believe it's real, right? When you feel you have presence in this environment. And so how do we build these things? And so frequently it's technological reasons or psychological reasons, right? It's where your head is at, or in fact what you can do in the world, right? Can you lift something up and it feels like you actually lift it using your body in a way that you intended, right? So there are a couple of theories, but one of the key things we felt is, social interactions really are a key factor, and nobody's really looked at that yet. So how is realness or reality sort of produced, when through interaction, right? What are the mechanisms here? And we started with a theory of and this is sort of empirically based research by Brickman, who said, there are two conditions under which people feel an environment is real, or, an experience is real. The first is that there's what sort of this internal, internal correspondence, that I'm acting in a way that's consistent with my feelings. I'm not play acting, I'm not pretending, right? It's basically, I'm just acting out sort of in a way that's authentic. And then the second is, and both of them have to be in place, the second is that your actions are actually responded to in a way that you would expect, right? So if I throw a ball, the ball just doesn't fall down here, right? It really goes. So there's this idea that, does not only other people, but also the objects around me, do they act in a way that I would expect, right? Is there external correspondence? The problem with Brickman's work is that he really didn't have much theory of why this would be. He sort of empirical results, right? That people would say, yes, under these two conditions, I feel the world is real, but what's really behind this? And we felt that Goffman has a lot to offer here. And so obviously Goffman's work is huge, right? And so we focused in on this notion of involvement obligation. So what does involvement obligation mean? So first of all, I guess, most of us will know Goffman's work from the presentation of self. This idea that, when we are on stage, like I am performing, right? I am performing an identity. So I'm trying to convince you with my clothing and with my PowerPoint presentations and with my gestures and with the material here that I'm smart and worthy to be listened to. right? So, that's an identity performance, right? Sort of, and so a lot of people, in the meantime, there's all sorts of stuff in the backstage that I'm not showing you, right? That's sort of how a lot of us know Goffman and what do we know about Goffman. And by the way, that work gets used quite a bit in virtual environments because then it's this idea that people are pretending, right? And that it's not real, right? That the backstage stuff, their physical body and so on and so forth, that's all backstage and you can't see it, right? So that theory sort of comes into this area of research quite a bit. But there's a sort of one of the things that we picked up on is that the reason we do this identity performance is essentially to be validated as real existing selves, right? So so if, for example, if I was standing here and none of you were listening to me, right? If you're all just doing your own thing and sort of making it very obvious that I'm not worthy to be listened to, then I've got a problem, right? Because then my identity performance is not working. It's not being validated. And what do I then make of this, right? They don't see me. I'm not relevant. I'm not interesting, right? I mean, essentially all of what I'm trying to do doesn't work. So this undermines the self, right? And so a key part of Goffman's work is that the self, who you are, right, who you believe you are, depends on interaction, and especially interaction that validates you. Right? That essentially, and this is what we call the involvement obligation, that we owe it to each other. And by the way, you might think, oh, gee, yes, right now because you're sitting there, you owe it to me, right? Because of the setup of the room and whatever. But at the end of the day, unless you participate in this, right, you also, yourself suffers because you rely on this interaction as much as I do. Right? And so, in the long run, there's this reciprocal, involvement obligation that we essentially create one another, right? We create each other's selves, and in doing so, we also create a reality. And so Goffman gives us that infrastructure to work with. And so this is, his theory. So what we did was essentially, looked at chat logs, where we sort of did a comparison of chat logs to see, okay, so how is this production, right, of selves and reality working in Second Life, in virtual reality. And so here was a chat log that we identified as basically producing low realness, in the sense that, using Brickman's two concepts, in this instance, they did not get to, the person who I was interviewing, so this was essentially Eileen. Eileen reported at the end of this incident that she was confused, right? She felt it was creepy because, the reaction she was getting from this guy she was interacting with, Jacob, were just not what she would have anticipated, right? So, in fact, the external correspondence aspect of reality, right, that condition was not met. So, if we then look at, right, this interaction, we can see a couple of things. So certainly from a point of view of, virtual worlds needing fidelity, needing to be like real life, right, we see some problems here. Namely, there's a sense of, there's lag, messages don't seem to be getting through, right? Sort of the interaction is like, and it's a faltering interaction somehow, right? So you'd say, okay, well, there's one reason why, this is a failed. So from a technical point of view, we could argue it's failed because of this. But from a social point of view, we can see other things. And a key thing we can see is that, so Eileen Jacob asks her, all the questions he asks her are pretty much about her real identity, right? Sort of a real life identity. Let's not say real identity, but real life identity, who she is in real life, and so are you Arabian? Are you a student later on? Are you American, right? Sort of it's always about banging on about who's this person behind the avatar, as opposed to paying attention, right, to her identity performance. Right? She's wearing a sari, she's nicely dressed, she's saying, I thought it was lovely. And he doesn't say, oh, I think it's lovely too. No compliments, no acknowledgements, right? And she doesn't compliment him either on his appearance, right? So neither of them seems to be focusing on the here and now, on the performances of each other. Right? And so, this carries on until eventually he offends her. So, you know, he basically carries on about, oh, you know, so who are you, blah, blah, blah. And she says, well, you know, I'm half Scottish, I'm half English. Blah, blah. And he says, oh, you know, that's like a hot combination, right? You must be a hot female. And she says, oh, well, here anyway, right? Wink, wink, sort of as a joke. Because again, this is something that people do all the time. They acknowledge that they're not themselves, right? They're not a representation, you know, of themselves as in real life self, or sort of embodiment, right? In Second Life. This is something, you know, that's virtual. It's enhanced, it's embellished, it's, you know, whatever. And so she says, you know, well, here anyway, I'm kind of hot, right? And he says, what, does that mean you're a cold female, right? And she's like, wait a minute. And actually, if you think about that, I mean, it's a very sharp comment, right? It's cutting through. It's saying, if you say it's in real life, and you're the opposite in second, you know, you're the opposite of in real life as what you are in Second Life, which, by the way, this opposition is a key, you know, this opposition between real and virtual, first life and Second Life, is a key concept, right, in this world. So he's just drawing the conclusion and just like, whoa. Wait a minute, this is not what I expected. It was a joke, right? This is what we all do. We all recognize that there's some distinction, but it doesn't mean opposition, right? And so this idea that she's a cold female and she now has to say something about this is like, I'm out of here. And so in fact, you know, this is when she leaves and she mutes him. It wants nothing more to do with him. So a failed interaction. So again, from involvement obligation, what are some of the elements we see here? We're seeing, you know, being offended, right? Sort of not helping. So part of the involvement obligation is that you help other people, you sort of in the performance of their identity, right? So, you know, the fact, again, that a lot of you are listening to me as opposed to basically ignoring me and having conversations amongst yourselves and so on, is in fact supporting, right, the kind of identity that I'm trying to perform here, right? Namely, as somebody who's worthy to be listened to. Yeah, and so if you weren't doing that, right, that would be sort of you're not helping me do the face work that I'm trying to do. And so we certainly see that here, right? Sort of no support for the face work. All right, so then let's look at sort of a very different interaction where, you know, there was definitely a sense of we all had a great time. We all understood what we were doing, you know, sort of very high energy and so on. And so this was, you know, she was meeting up with a friend. And so what's interesting here is she used material, right? She used these sparkly earrings and an over-the-top wig and all sorts of stuff to basically get this guy's attention and to basically have a laugh. Right? And so she knew he didn't like, you know, sparkly stuff because it creates lag. And so, you know, she knew he'd get sort of say something snarky about it, right? And so by showing up with sparkly earrings, she's already setting up a certain kind of interaction, right, where they're both drawing attention. And obviously he does, right? He sort of notices and, you know, they compliment each other. You know, she sort of says, oh, and I like your look too, right? Very different, right? They're paying attention to the here and now, to the identity performance, you know, the appearance, all of those things. And he sort of makes exactly the same comment, like, I'm trying to look as wrinkly as I am in real life, right? Sort of, again, sort of, you know, this notion that real life and Second Life are different, right? You look different, you are different, and just acknowledging it, you know, by saying, oh, well, I'm trying very hard to be like in real life. Anyway, so, you know, the interaction, so later on, her, and by the way, the reason it's a different name is because she was using her alt in this instance, but they all knew her as Eileen and actually referred to her as Eileen, right? So it's just like, okay, well, you're coming in with a different body, but really you're the same person, and so, you know, we're not going to make any distinctions here. Anyhow, so, you know, they all have a great time, and if you look at, you know, if you just look at the, you know, within 1 minute, you know, and you compare the number of interactions within 1 minute to, you know, the interactions that we had in the previous one, you can see there's a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, right? And also a lot of this, you know, acknowledging the other, validating the other, and basically everybody coming out saying this was real, you know, and we've created not only reality, but we've also helped create each other. Okay, so what are some of the key insights here? So, you know, this notion of involvement obligation as being a key mechanism in social environments, right? So social media, they are social, right? So looking at sort of these social interactions and what are we doing to support one another, producing selves in social reality. So we thought it was definitely a useful concept to be working with. The need to verbalize what's going on for you, to verbalize what you're looking at, what you're paying attention to. In real life, we do this very quickly by, just a glance or a head nod or, how we direct our bodies. And in Second Life, you basically, or in these virtual worlds, you have to say it, because otherwise people don't know, right? And so in order to, grease the skids of this interaction, right, letting the other person know where you're at, you've really got to articulate these things. This notion of joint activity. So one thing I haven't highlighted too much is that in the first instance, she was dancing with Jacob. But so it's a joint activity, right? So they're basically both focused on this dance. But a dance is scripted. You don't have to do anything. It's like putting your avatar on autopilot. And so, that doesn't sort of require the same kind of attention to the world as, for example, in the second example, they were driving go-karts. And so there, they had to pay attention, right? You have to direct the go-kart, there's speed, there's all sorts of stuff. And so just the amount of effort that has to go into this joint activity makes a difference in terms of attending, paying attention to the other. So joint activity in these social, virtual environments is, again, a key thing to sort of create reality and to create persons. And then material. Right? So I've indicated earlier on how essentially by having material, you allow the other to stay involved, right? Part of this is helping each other stay involved, helping each other do this face work, do this identity performance and validation, right? And so using material to do that was certainly something that we could see here in Second Life. And the other thing is it defined what kind of social occasion this was, right? So the first was, dancing in a very fancy nightclub, right? And the second was, visiting somebody at home and, walking through their house and commenting and sort of, oh, that's a nice place. Oh, you created this nicely, right? So this idea of complimenting each other on your house, right? Which is exactly what a guest who comes to your house for the first time most probably will do, right? Say nice things. And, again, we take it for granted, but here we can see it starts mattering, right? Oh, it matters in real life too, but... Okay, so now for something completely different. Okay, so here the issue is that people were struggling with this issue of what is real and what is virtual. This question of, is this me or is this my avatar? Do I have agency or does my avatar have agency? Would I call this real or would I call this virtual? Would I call this fantasy? Would I call this play? Right, so there were multiple words that people used to say, this isn't quite real. Okay, so what was interesting about this was, that people would say things like, oh, Second Life is an environment that is consequence-free, I can do whatever I like, and then in the next breath they would say, somebody really offended me and I was upset and I was crying the entire evening. Okay, so what is it? Is it a consequence-free environment? Or is it an environment that essentially is as real life? Where do we stand on this? And the thing is that people never settled. They never settled on this question, right? In one interview, they would give you examples of each. In one sentence, they would say, I am doing this and she is doing this. Right? And so, these boundaries between, is it my avatar, is it me, is it real, is it not, right? Very, very fluid, very, very problematic. And so this engine of inquiry that Dick Boland that inspired me here is that the idea is that we can understand these oscillations, right? And we see these oscillations quite a bit, right? So in management, he uses the example of management theory that says, on the one hand, we should be rational, right? And then there are these fads that say, we should be a family and we should, empower workers and work with the good nature of people, right? Things like that. So we've had papers that looked at this, oscillation between these two types of organizational philosophies, if you want, right, or schema about organizations. And so he's trying to understand, well, why is it that these things don't settle? right? Why don't we settle this and find sort of an optimum and stick with it? Why do we, why are there's some things where the conversation keeps going, where this oscillation keeps happening? And so he draws on Lakoff and Johnson, who basically identified that, there are sort of 4 image schemas, right, with which people that people use as metaphors to make sense of the world. And these are the container, the relations, the trajectory, and the entity. And that, what happens with these is that you work on one schema, and all of a sudden, when that starts breaking down, you basically move to a different schema. And then the conversation carries on. And then you move back to the first schema, and the conversation carries on. So there's a woman, Naomi Quinn, who basically looked at marriages and how people talk about their marriages, and that's exactly what she found, right? So, you basically move along and you describe your marriage in sort of, we're on this trajectory, right? Things are going well. And then all of a sudden, things flip to, but really, we should be, a container, right? Where we're really, and so, so basically you find fault with the one, and so you move to the next. And then you track back up again. So this idea of these oscillations between the various schema. Anyway, so let me give you an example. So the two, if we look at Second Life, it's definitely, you could describe it as a container, right? This notion of I am in world, I'm logging in. Similarly, the self, right? Going into the self, right? So if and then it's also relations, right? Self as relations. That we just talked about that. That essentially you rely on others, right, to define the self. Second Life, similarly, it's about being social, right? If you don't have any friends in Second Life or on Facebook, there's something wrong with you. Okay, so there's an expectation, right, that this is what these worlds are about. If we define the virtual and the real, right? So if you're a container and you're on the surface, right, then you're superficial. You don't quite get to the real. The real is going deep, right? Going into yourself, really sort of getting insight into who you truly are, right? Sort of this going deep. And similarly in the relations, we can either have we're separate. So, I'm alone in this world and I'm making sense of it, and I really don't know whether this is reality because I don't have an objective sense of what's going on, right? Because nobody else is there to validate it, versus, we're all in agreement, right? This is basically real, right? So it's this continuum of reality, of individually perceived reality and socially constructed reality, right? That's what we're seeing here. Okay, so when you are doing identity work in this world, you essentially are trying to get deep. You're trying to get a sense, you're trying to get insight. So people are doing these identity performances and then they ask the question of, is that me? What does it say about me that I've done these things, right? And so this idea that, it gives you, by self-reflection, going deep, you get an insight into who you are. Similarly, if I'm separate, if I'm on my own, right, unless I interact, exactly as Goffman says, I don't get a sense of self. So the need to interact with a sense of self. But here's then what happens. So if you're going down, you're going deep, right? All of a sudden, you become very selfish, self-absorbed, right? Sort of navel-gazing. And in fact, you're pretty isolated then. So, what is essentially good in terms of making progress, right, towards an understanding of self, all of us on the other scheme flips back and says, you're isolated, you're a hermit. You're selfish too, because, you're spending all this time, doing navel gazing as opposed to interacting with other people. And then similarly, on the flip side, if you're too much with other people, if you're depending too much on this validation, then you're also shallow, right? Where's your sense of self in all of this? So what you've got then is this perpetual motion machine, right? That never settles. So in terms of, is it real, is it not? Am I real, am I not? Where do I want to be positioned? Do I want to sort of pretend that Second Life is completely separate from real life? Or do I want to say it's a continuum with real life? The issue is you never settle because you're constantly bouncing around. So I'll give you an empirical example of this. With a woman called Angela. Now, Angela was essentially somebody who was in Second Life to do BDSM role play, right? So sub-dom kind of role play. And she considered herself a dominant in real life, and so she had these subs, right, in second life. But then she also engaged in a relationship where she was the submissive, and she had a master. And so the reason I'm showing these kind of woodcut images is because unfortunately I can't show, images where I have people other than my participants. And I know, it's a bit hard to see, but it's sort of the best I can do with giving you a sense, again, of the photo diaries and the context here. So on the left-hand side, we see her with two of her subs, and they, she's had a hard day. She's sitting in her throne in her house, right, which is very castle-like, and they're rubbing her feet. You can see that her subs all have collars on, right? That's sort of part of this sub-dom role play, right? That people have collars on, and you can then direct commands at those collars and yank people away and make the wearer of the collar do stuff that they might not want to do, but hey, they're subs, right? They're supposed to be doing what they're supposed to be. Anyway. So here's Angela, and she has a sort of a specific situation where she's doing exactly this backing and forthing. So on the surface, she sort of, so she gets into this relationship with Ira, right? So she, personally, in real life, she says, I am a dominant. I am somebody that bosses people around. I want to be in control, right? That is who I am. But then she sort of, gets into this relationship where she's now submissive, and she's like, okay, well, this is play. I'm just trying this out. I just want to see what it's like with Ira. Okay, she's in this relationship with Ira, and this is play. Not real, virtual. But as she does this, she recognizes, I actually really, really feel like, she learned something about herself, that, she really has the desire to be taken care of and to get married. Right? In real life, she isn't married. And so she's going very, very deep in terms of this understanding, this insight. So, to stay in this relationship would basically mean, in the submissive relationship, would basically mean that, to keep on this role play, it's all about herself, right? It's very selfish to keep doing this just because she wants to get more insights into, what she's like. And so she recognizes this, that it's selfish, right? That she's in this relationship for self-learning. And really what she should be doing is paying more attention to him and his needs. And so, wants to be a supportive partner. But that then means that she has to bring her real life into this, right? So they're talking about real life a lot. She basically becomes dominant, right? So the role play has gone bust, yeah? Sort of in terms of, where she started out, right? It's basically at the opposite end. And so she's not happy with this either. So she goes back to, okay, so, I need to practice. I need to practice, being submissive again. So I'm going to, do these kneeling poses and sort of get myself into, submissive mind frame and so on. And then, what happens next is, she recognizes, I am really, I hold grudges, I'm full of pride, these kinds of things. Again, insight about herself. And then recognizes that, gee, that's actually, in terms of the relationships with others, right? Because she's got this family of, 3 submissives and, this partner that she has. So this is her family in second life. That, she's her need to always be right is really quite hurtful and quite damaging, right? And sort of isolating, right? And so what she decides to do as the next thing is, I'm only going to go into second life if, in fact, I'm in a good mood. Right? Because all this prideful stuff, all the stress that I feel and so on and so forth, I'm not allowed to have that happen. So I'm going to only go in when I'm in a good mood, when I can really control my emotions and so on. Well, what does that mean? Basically back up to surface, right? You're not being real. Okay? So, what I hope you take away from this is sort of this, again, perpetual motion machine, right? That whatever you do on a different register, you're back to square one. You're back to this is virtual. Sometimes you want to go back to the virtual, right? Sometimes, you're driven, to the sort of the natural progression is towards the real, and that makes sense because, in fact, the virtual is real but not actual. Right? It is possibly real, but it's not actual. So there's, in the whole definition of what the virtual is, you've got sort of this tension there. So what does this mean for Cyborgian identity work? So to me, what this means is that when people switch on the diagonals, it's what I would call the agential cut, right? So for those of you who've done, looked at some of the socio-materiality stuff and Karen Barad's work, she sort of has this understanding that everything is together, right? So that in this case, the cyborg, the avatar and the person, they are together. They're not separate and then brought together. They're together. But we make cuts, right? We sort of distinguish between this is me, this is not me. This is real, this is not real, right? And so my sense here is that these diagonals, when you switch back, right, from becoming too real, right, and this is the thing, the movement to the right is always, it's becoming too real, and now I need to switch back. And so that's when the agential cut happens. So I think what this perpetual motion machine or this engine of inquiry potentially gives us is the reason why people make cuts at certain points in time. But it also highlights that this is very situated, right? These aren't sort of, possibly over time we could sort of identify patterns, but really, this is a very situated kind of decision that gets made. And so, this distinction between real and virtual is never going to be settled, right? It's an ongoing struggle that people have to resolve as part of the identity work. So that to me is sort of the main, the main insight here. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time here a little bit, so I'll just give a few highlights. So this is the work with Magnus. So again, we're trying to understand these material discursive practices. And a key thing that, we based this on, or that we started with, was, what are the discourses of Second Life? How do people, what are the general framings that people, have of Second Life, right? And these framings that, ideologies that enable and basically, make certain identities possible, and what are those identities that are made possible through these discourses. So there's the discourse on virtuality, which is, that the virtual world is separate from and an alterity to real life. So the separation, and what this immediately sets up is this notion of me versus my avatar. Right? I versus, my avatar's name, he or she. And so, this is, so basically in terms of the way that the entire, environment is framed, right? Also this idea of first life, second life, right? It's all in this language already, that this distinction is set up. Then we have the sociality discourse, which essentially says you should have friends, right? And there's a very clear sense that you need to bring your real life into Second Life. You need to be authentic. You need to be a person. You need to recognize that there's a real person behind the avatar, right? And that concern for that real person, their emotions, right? That's sort of what this discourse says you need to do, and is the right behavior. And the kinds of identities, are relational identities, and they're various kinds. So mother, sister, brother, warrior, because there are a lot of clans, right? And sort of role play within Second Life. So, you have sort of these relational identities there. And all of those then become discourses, right? And then the market discourse. So this was really big, the idea that you accumulate capital. Who you become is basically the capital you can accumulate. And the capital you can accumulate in Second Life becomes capital in real life. So, for example, the money you made in Second Life became money in real life, right? Just as a very basic. And so this idea of I am, what I own, is sort of the vision view of identity here. And sort of producers and consumers are key in this. So just to give you a brief sense of what we're trying to do then in this particular work is, we're looking at, again, the performative nature of identity. That identities get produced through mundane discursive material action. Mundane actions like dressing my avatar, mundane actions like interacting with other people, building things, right? Sort of mundane, everyday actions. That is what produces identities. And so, so her, in the case of Mantis, she was a 43-year-old woman who basically is married, been married for over 20 years, got married very young, is unhappy about that fact, had a child very young, feels that basically, she, you know, at 20 she'd lost her youth, and all the things that a 20-year-old would have done, you know, she never did. So Second Life has an opportunity to basically revisit, be young again, right? Sort of experience these things. Then also in real life she's a nurse, right? Which means she's wearing uniform. She's not even allowed to put nail varnish on, right? So all these restrictions around the body. And in Second Life, oh man, she can express herself in all sorts of ways, right? She's wearing leather and tattoos and pink spiky hair. She can be very emotional. She can dress for emotions. Again, nurses, you know, no, it's got to be, these are caregivers, right? They've got to be even-keeled and even-tempered. And, you know, in Second Life, she can listen to angry music because she likes angry music, right? So that's, you know, so she definitely, right from the get-go, sets up this alterity, right? I can be this alternate self. And so obviously what pops out, right, is this alternate self. She frames herself in real life as shy and, you know, basically not good in social situations. And Second Life, man, I'm edgy. I've got friends, you know, sort of, I'm cool. So very different, right? Because of this alterity setup, you then produce these, you know, in real life I'm this, and in Second Life I'm this. So, you know, she's basically, again, this kind of identity is produced through discourses as well as through material, okay? But the key thing is she ultimately, like, you know, Angela that we talked about just now, she gains insights about what she believes is her true self. So she says, you know, there's a lot more to me than I present or can present in real life, and this is coming out in Second Life. But then she also realizes, oh, gee, you know, if it is my true self, then I should be doing self-improvement in real life. Right? So this idea of, okay, so I separated, but now I'm getting insights into my real life self, which is basically back to the real life, which I just separated, right? And I'm actually going to have to do self-improvement work in this real life, right? So she recognizes, well, gee, you know, there's something fishy about this discourse. There's something, virtuality, you know, ultimately breaks down and becomes something more like sociality. That now I'm, you know, need to, you know, and again, she was also engaged in sort of a relationship in Second Life, even though she was married, right? And so what's interesting there is that she basically needed to do everything. She recognized that this was a slippery slope, right? This distinction between First Life and Second Life was a slippery slope. And she, you know, fallen victim to things, you know, for example, she'd had a relationship, went very badly, it ended, and she got sick. She was that upset. She got really, really sick. And so she sort of said, I can never get myself that immersed in Second Life again, right? Because she felt she'd mixed real life and Second Life. So now she needed to make sure she maintained this boundary. But she knew this was hard. So what did she do? She used her physical body to enact the boundary. She moved her computer from the small little, you know, corner of her bedroom into the main den where she saw her husband while she was in Second Life. Her husband was sitting there on the couch. She's having virtual sex, watching her husband on the couch, right? That's basically her saying, I don't want to get that sucked in. I need to be reminded that there's a real life and that this is different from real life. Okay, my husband's sitting there, right? But I am here. And also to basically prevent her body, right? Her voice. Like no voice, because now she's in the public space, and so she can only type, only chat, you know, no pictures, no voice, no cams, no nothing, right? So to sort of say, my body, right, my physical body stays here, and it stays in my relationship with my real life husband, and that's a marriage that I'm not willing to put at risk, right? But this is not an affair. What I'm having in Second Life is not an affair because it doesn't involve the body. Right? Doesn't involve the real body. So, you know, this kind of reasoning, right? This is going on. This is what people are, why people, there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake with regard to managing these boundaries, managing what is real and what is virtual, what I keep in, what I keep out. Because essentially it could cost people's marriage, for example, in this instance. Okay, so what are some of the key insights here? So like I said, you know, identity gets produced through this mundane enactment of material discursive or discursive material practices. There's a lot of interdiscursivity going on, right? Sort of mixing, bending, changing of discourses. And this shouldn't surprise us because essentially discourses have become somewhat unhinged from institutional structures, right? In late or post-modernity. And then, a key issue here is the physical body and the role of the physical body. How do we theorize this? Emotions. So there's a lot of stuff going on with emotions, and emotions are embedded in the physical body. And so, emotions is what, people feel that as long as I'm emotionally true, even though my digital body doesn't look anything like my real body, I am being true, right, to others by being emotionally real. Right? So physically I'm not real, but emotionally I'm real, right? So this is part of how they make sense of I'm basically giving the other, right? Sort of exactly going back to the Goffman stuff we just talked about, I'm being authentic in my emotions. And thereby I am setting up the conditions to produce others' selves, my own self, and social reality. Okay, so this idea of emotions coming through, even though physical bodies are not coming through, right? This permeability of boundaries, right? There's a lot of stuff that needs to be theorized there. Okay, so I do have a wrap-up slide, and this dualism of virtuality and reality. Early on, we had a discussion, and the question is it useful? Certainly, this particular technology forced this duality. By being called Second Life, by essentially making it impossible for you to use your real life name in world, right? You were forced to use a name from last name from a drop-down box, so that way you could have your first name could be the same as in real life, but not your last name. So it was forcing a distinction. In addition to your embodiment being so different, right? So there were some forced distinctions. And so the question is, to what extent is this virtuality, reality, duality sensible or useful in other contexts, right? So, example, Facebook. Do people perceive this as, that there's sort of a potential, is this just an extension of reality, or is there really a question of, there's something virtual about this that is distinctive from reality? What's the problematic there? Then I think this goes back to socio-materiality. I think Magnus and I, are taking a weak socio-materiality approach in the sense that we're saying, we're keeping discourse and matter separate, as opposed to saying they're so deeply entangled that ontologically they're no separate, right? Or that virtual bodies and real bodies are not separate, because in some sense I feel that, I speak for myself, Magnus, not for you. I feel that there's something, the virtual body has unique capabilities, if you want, right? And it has meaning because it is not the real body. That there is more control over it, right? And so that the material matters, right? And so if the material matters seriously, then I think, keeping them apart and theorizing them as separate, but nevertheless tightly intertwined, which is, I think, what you see in the work here, right, of bodies and discourse and different kinds of materialities and so on, then I think we will make progress in terms of theorizing it. So with that, I will end, and I am sorry to have run over time. I'm happy to take questions. Okay, so the question is that, Second Life in some ways, the distinction between virtuality and reality, right, you basically would say is not useful, that essentially that basically I'm becoming a truer version of myself in the virtual world, or can become that, and therefore, it is real. So the fact that you're putting stuff out there reflects that it's you, right? I think, yes and no, because I do think that the material, right, the material world makes that possible. If we didn't have these virtual spaces, right, if the material didn't matter, then people wouldn't be doing it. And so I do think that honoring or sort of recognizing that there's a certain material makeup, right, where you can depart from your real life body, where you can only use text, where you have a lot of control over that text, you have a lot of control over that representation, that allows you to get to this point where you then produce something that you then claim is you. So I think there's another aspect here, and this is where the performativity, I think, comes in, that by simply enacting these practices, right, of dressing the avatar and sort of choosing certain basic things, all of a sudden the avatar takes on a life on its own. And then, the true me is usually a very selective kind of representation, or sort of very selective kind of, sort of representation, because, I sort of choose the true me, the stuff that's flattering, right? That I call the true me. Stuff that's unflattering, I sort of go, well, that was just the avatar, or that was just a fluke, or that was just that, right? So in some ways, this idea of, coming to a truer reflection of yourself or so on, again, is produced and then selected, right, through a process of identity work where you basically make sense of the performances that you have seen, right, or the identities that have been produced in these various places. So I think collapsing everything into the real, I think sort of saying, we don't need to talk about virtuality, this distinction isn't useful. I, again, would say that from a material point of view, I would question that. And I think, certainly the people that I interviewed, their narrative is one of, in this space, right, it is separate from the real. I, have certain liberties, and yes, I bring it back. I sort of flow stuff through, but I can make those cuts. I can decide, right? And that, I think some of that is true in real life too, but it's very particular. It's a very particular kind of material assemblage or very particular material construction that makes that possible and that makes that narrative possible. So I don't know whether that answers your question. Question was, to what extent are the phenomena, especially the separation between real life and second life, and this idea that in second life you can become, a very different alternative self, or present and become this alternative self. To what extent is that a cultural phenomenon? So, yes, I studied people mostly in Texas and Oklahoma that were living there because I needed the face-to-face interaction. So, how generalizable is this culturally? So I don't have a clear answer to that, but I certainly know of studies that were done in the UK, or incidents in the UK. So, so for example, there was one case written up in the UK where a woman had been in second life and met somebody in second life. They got married in real life, and then the next thing, her husband was cheating on her in second life, and she was completely distraught. And people were going, "My goodness, it's second life. That's not a real affair. That's not real cheating." And her response was, it is more cheating, because essentially what he's cheating against is the ideal me. It is the person that, the person that I, it's the essence of me. It's all I can be. In real life, he might cheat on me because I've got a body that's overweight and I can't do anything about it. Or I've got a medical condition, or, I'm so-and-so old and I don't look like a 22-year-old anymore. But none of that applies in second life. I can be who I want to be in second life. I can be the best me. And he cheated against the best me. Where do I have to go after that? And, I thought, boy, that was super insightful. So, so I'd say the phenomena are the same. Certainly, this UK example would suggest that. So, but I can't address sort of in Asian cultures versus European cultures. My sense is that European cultures most probably, yes, it's somewhat generalizable, but I don't know about Latin cultures and I don't know about Asian cultures. So again, a good question, and would be fun to look into, people who've done studies on those populations. Thank you. A question is about language and the use of language and language practices, right, to create identities, and the answer is yes. One person that I was in the sample, she would in order to, again, it's about giving people nuance, right? So early on I said you need to sort of tell people, you need to articulate what you're looking at, what you're feeling, right? Because these things are not obvious as they are in real life. And similarly with language, if you're typing, how do you, I mean, you saw a lot of LOLs, a lot of exclamation points, a lot of smiley faces, right? Emoticons, which is what a lot of people would do. But this woman would capitalize wherever she wanted to sort of, exactly, right? So it was EX and then exactly, capital A, CT, right? To basically create this emphasis of this is what I'm saying, this is what I'm feeling. So that's an example that comes to mind right now in use of language. Now, the other thing where language I think is interesting is that a lot of what happened in Second Life is that you would have an object and the object would articulate, right? So you hit something and it would let out a yelp or sort of clap, clap, clap or something like that, right? So you'd have these objects that would essentially put text into chat to essentially perform, right? What you would want to perform without you having to type all this stuff out. And so and this, by the way, came in particularly with sexual poses, right? And or sort of, you basically would get what you call these animation overrides that essentially allowed you to have sex. And so the sexual poses would then articulate, right? They would write. So it wasn't you writing, it was, this engine, sort of the algorithm having you perform sex, right, would write. And some people were fine with it, others hated it, right? So, but nevertheless, that I think is another aspect of use of language, maybe not so much in identity performance, but, in terms of being performed, right? Certainly that was going on, yeah. The question was, what about disabilities in online and especially in Second Life? There was a lot of it going on. Yeah, and so people, some people actually wanted to present themselves as disabled, right? So they would be in wheelchairs in Second Life and, to essentially make people aware of who they were. Others, I mean, one guy in my sample, for example, it wasn't a disability, but he essentially, had bad allergies and had trouble breathing at times. And so in order to get sympathy from others, he would wear this mask. And so, and this mask made this, sort of, it was a mask that you would wear, in outer space. And so he'd wear this mask and it would make these sounds, right? And all he wanted was for people to ask him why he was wearing the mask. So he could tell them that he was having terrible allergies and he couldn't breathe in real life, right? He wanted that sympathy. So that was certainly a strategy. The disabilities that I had in my sample were certainly sexual disabilities, right? And so that people, were, had lost the ability to have sex in real life. And so that was one of the things that they found particularly helpful and liberating in Second Life. But I know that there was a lot of work going on with people with disabilities, a community of people with disabilities. And to the point, that's the other area. There were apparently a lot of people with Asperger's syndrome in Second Life because it allowed them, because the inability to read faces, right, and sort of read a social context. So having everything textualized was very helpful for them. And so that was definitely going on in Second Life. So there was actually a lot around disability. Again, it wasn't a focus of my work. I just had a couple of people, where it was very clear that they had a form of disability that they were dealing with. And Second Life was a way for them to feel like they had, gained back physical capabilities that they had lost. Yeah. Question was one of, what happens if we're in an environment where people are interacting with machines as opposed to with other people, right, in virtual worlds, whether, some of the ideas here are relevant. And so, yeah, I think certainly the Goffman-esque stuff most probably wouldn't be unless, and machines are starting to talk, right? I mean, if you think about RFID, right, tags, they're already talking. And so to the extent that they become animated in that way. And then it really, that's the one thing that you do learn from these studies in virtual worlds. It really doesn't matter all that much whether somebody has a physical, a body that looks like a human body, or, is in some way other, looks other. And even poor resolutions, right? As long as, your interaction with the person produces the kind of reaction that you would expect, it is real. And so maybe it's not the interaction, but maybe Brickman's work actually would be relevant, because he doesn't limit it to the objects, right? He doesn't limit it to humans. He basically would say that even objects, as long as the objects interact with you or react the way you would anticipate, you'd be fine. So some good ideas, yeah, it'd be cool. The question is one of, if you build an avatar that is really sort of your best representation of self, and then you get negative feedback, maybe similar to, the woman in the UK who basically put out her best self and still was cheated on, what happens? What sort of happens as a result? Because this is not a psychological study, right, I don't have data on this. But the one thing that I can say is that, first of all, I think this idea that there is sort of a true self that you go in with and then build an avatar around. I don't think that's the way it works. I much more believe in this performative idea, right? That you go in and you're just going through the motions, right? You're interacting with people, you're dressing your avatar, you're doing the stuff that you would do every day, and ultimately through the performances, you then produce sort of a sense of self, and you then call that your true self. So that's more of a production rather than I know what it is and then it's either good or bad, right? I have good reactions to it, I have negative reactions to it. So just in terms of the framing, I think I'd be on a somewhat different place than you in terms of that framing. But having said that, I did have one case in my sample where a woman basically killed her avatar, right? I mean, in the sense of she had all these relationships, and she basically didn't like where she was. She basically didn't like who she'd become. And she didn't like the friends that she had. And so her only way of really, disconnecting ties was to go into witness protection, quote unquote, right? And literally eliminate her avatar, build a new avatar, and go back to none of her friends. And so that was hard work for her, but she did do it. And so I don't know, so people do scrap their avatar, for sure. And the key thing is that they want to leave the relationships behind. Right, so and that I think is important to recognize here, that the relationships, were a key part of defining and constraining identity, and so that was her strategy of literally. Okay. Yeah. So just to repeat this Harvard study over 80 years, trying to understand happiness came out with relationships are what's key to happiness. So yeah, and unhappiness in this case, right, of this woman saying, I'm starting new. But even that is really amazing, right? I mean, again, this is the materiality, right? The materiality matters. That one day you can decide, I'm not going to go on that account anymore. I'm going to create a new avatar, and I'm not going back to anything. I'm not wearing the same clothes. I don't want to be recognized. I'm not going to move in the same circles, right? How do you do that in real life from one day to the next? Are you going to move from here to Timbuktu? Is that what it's going to take? How hard is that? All of these things, right, are certainly going to take a lot more infrastructure and a lot more nerve and, determination than, one day deciding. And it wasn't easy for her. I don't want to make it sound easy, because starting over is always hard, but certainly nowhere near, moving sort of countries and states and whatever. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah. And thank you for coming here in real life.
Oh, yes.
And here is a present for your real physical body. It's a virtual version of it in Second Life, waiting for you.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much, and really appreciate the interactions. Thank you. Do you want me to open it right now? Should I open it?